in some ways, this seems like a wrong question, right? Capitalism, although it's dominant and is, seems to have spread all across the world, it's just one way of organizing human activity. And throughout history, it's always existed alongside other ways of organizing our collective lives, as it were, right? So even today, if you take a look at it, a lot of your activity, maybe even most of your activity, isn't structured directly by capitalism the way that we've understood it. So, for example, families or your interaction with the government. Broadly, non-capitalist institutions. Some of us are part of co-ops. There are other ways of organizing that are very far-reaching in all our lives. And of course, even capitalist organizations aren't entirely capitalist, as it were. It's like a mix between an army and a village, as people have said, right? So in some sense, I think the question about whether it will survive indefinitely, clearly nothing survives indefinitely, hasn't survived indefinitely. And it seems that in many cases, a lot of our lives, there's a dialectic. And sometimes the capitalist movement actually seems to be more, and sometimes it actually seems to be less. And I would argue, and I think one of the things that Josh and I have been discussing a lot, is that maybe what we're seeing, and we shall continue to see, is a slow sort of disentanglement of a lot of our lives as the forces of production become more productive, as you start to see that organizing our lives this way is maybe completely irrational, that we will slowly but surely start to reorganize our ways in ways that are more more meaningful and more humane, if you will. Yeah, so I'll stop with this.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's multiple modes of production, whatever phrase you like, ways of organizing human activity that coexist next to each other. It's not either all capitalism or all something else. And actually, there's already today a lot of other stuff, even though in certain settings the sphere of capital is expanding, but in others it's diminishing. And so it doesn't have to be the question, oh, is capitalism going to be abolished and replaced by something else? It's an incremental process. And actually, if you go back and read what Marx said, that's what he said too. He has a line towards the end of Capital. He says, the socialist revolution will be infinitely less violent than the bourgeois revolution because all of the structures of socialism will have already developed before it's sort of the sort of final abolition of capitalism. But we don't even have to imagine that final abolition. You can imagine a diminishing sphere of activities that still look sort of like capitalism. Just the same way, you might say, theology was once this overwhelming organizing principle of social legitimation and structuring all kinds of social activities. Some people spend a lot of time worrying about it, but it doesn't affect the rest of us very much at all. So you can imagine that sort of incremental diminishing of the sphere where capitalist logic applies without a decisive break. And I think when you frame it that way, it's clarifying, because we don't have to think, well, can there be another Russian Revolution or whatever? Because that's not, if you can imagine the displacement of capitalism by other ways of organizing productive activity without imagining that sort of violent transition. I think, that said, there obviously is still today an enormous area of life that is organized along capitalist lines. And I think, that does create some major problems for us in terms of things like dealing with the climate crisis. Not so much. I think people sometimes have this idea that, well, capitalism is a system of endless accumulation, so that means we always need more oil, more energy, more material. I don't think that's true. I think we can easily imagine, in fact, can see the beginnings of a kind of material delinking. But where there really is a problem is that when we sort of set up all of most of our productive activity on the base of private property, and we've kind of got these little dictatorships where people with their business, their property, are supposed to be able to do, whatever they want, then that creates a real obstacle to any sort of rational collective action. And a lot of the sort of economic transformations we're going to have to carry out if we want to, maintain a planet that can support our civilization, are going to require large-scale, rapid, coordinated transformations of things like our power system, our transportation system. We're going to need different land use patterns, denser cities, and it's very hard to do that on the basis of individuals' profit-seeking behavior. So that's, I think, where the real obstacle lies, and the thing that we not so much some sort of objective drive for growth, but there is there is, I think with the kind of transformations decarbonization is going to require, a need for a more conscious, centralized decision-making authority than really sits comfortably with our sort of existing ways of organizing production.
Yeah, just to continue on that, on those lines, right? I mean, if you take maybe a defense of capitalism, the historical defense of capitalism, which there may be some truth to, is that show me a system which has led to so much prosperity in the past, and that's true. There, capitalism versus the previous systems has led to the development of the force of production and so on, but if you take aside England and maybe Netherlands and so on, those places where it does seem to have been some sort of strange sort of sui generis process, all the later industrializers really, very much were only able to transform because of extremely clear direction of the force of the production, direction, if you will, of industrialization, mobilization of resources. It's almost always needed a leading role for collective action, right? And so if we assume that we're going to tackle the problems of the world by the kind of elements of, if you will, completely decentralized actions, with markets really sort of allocating resources, that's going to be a disaster. That's just not going to allow us to deal with the kind of issues of climate change and other crises that are looming. And so, in that sense, if we really are to survive, we as a species, and I think it's it really is a question that confronts us now very urgently. It will require us to move away from the way that we've imagined that we ought to be organizing society along these lines, and have a much more rational collective effort.